This is Ringler Radio, where you get all the latest news and information about structured settlements from Ringler Associates, the first name in structured settlements, helping injured people and their families since 1975. Ringler Radio is made possible in part by Allstate, American General, John Hancock, Liberty Mutual, MetLife, Mutual of Omaha, New York Life, Pacific Life, and Prudential. Now join Ringler Radio host Larry Cohen.
Well, hello and welcome to Ringler Radio, everyone. I'm Larry Cohen, the head of Ringler Associates Northeast Operations, and we're certainly glad you could join us again today. Well, there are approximately 25 million veterans in the United States from all the wars and all the branches of service, and veterans are at a heightened risk of developing mesothelioma or other fatal asbestos diseases as a result of asbestos exposure. In fact, veterans comprise 30% of all known mesothelioma deaths that have occurred in this country. Well, today on Ringler Radio, we'll take a look at asbestos litigation involving veterans, explore asbestos exposure with the emphasis on mesothelioma and other asbestos-related diseases. And joining me today as my co-host is my friend and Ringler colleague, Manny Valdez, from the Ringler offices in Los Angeles, San Diego, and Las Vegas. Manny's been a certified structured settlement consultant for 34 years. His expertise is well acknowledged across the west part of the country, and he's worked with clients and attorneys in a variety of cases. And he's also a veteran, having served in the U.S. Army and having been honorably discharged. Manny, that's quite a record, quite a bio for yourself. Welcome to Ringler Radio.
Thanks, Larry. Appreciate it very much.
Terrific. Well, our special guest today is attorney Steven Kazan, founding senior and managing principal of the firm Kaizen, McClain, Satterley, and Greenwood in Oakland, California. Steve has played a significant role in asbestos litigation for over 4 decades. He's filed his first case on behalf of an asbestos victim in 1974, and since then has represented thousands of injured workers and their family members in various court cases. So, Steve, welcome to the show. Great to have you here on Ringler Radio.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be with you guys.
Terrific. Well, Steve, you've been working with asbestos victims since 1974. Talk to us about the dangers of asbestos and the impact it's had on veterans. Give us a little overview.
Well, in general, asbestos is something that it contains a lot of little fibers that get in the air. People breathe them, and after 20, 30 years can develop a variety of very serious diseases, including several different kinds of cancers, the most important of which, as you mentioned, is mesothelioma, which has only asbestos as a known cause. It also can cause things like lung cancer and other kinds of cancers. So it's a very serious problem. It's a problem that's been known for the last 100 years, the dangers of asbestos. And since the 1930s, doctors have known that it causes a variety of cancers. And so it's been something that has been a major problem in industrial society, particularly in the United States, ever since. And it's a real problem for veterans, of course, because they tend to have a lot of exposure, or at least they did back in the day.
Can you, Larry, I was going to share a little bit when I was in Vietnam as a veteran and now here in San Diego. San Diego has probably one of the highest, and certainly California has one of the highest concentrations of the military we have here in San Diego in the Navy, the U.S. Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. We have a serious problem. We have a serious problem with homelessness. Many of the homeless people are veterans. They are suffering, and I see it every day as I drive into downtown, and the exposure that I can see that's related to, injuries based on those diseases.
Well, yeah, it's particularly a problem in an area like yours because the primary place where veterans are exposed is in the U.S. Navy. Obviously, it also affects the Army, the Coast Guard as well, which is similar to the Navy in that regard. And as well, people who worked in the government shipyards on those vessels. So it's a very serious problem for anybody who has military experience.
You know, interestingly, and I didn't realize we were going to have this show today to ask her about it, but my wife's uncle was a chemical engineer at the University of West Virginia years ago, and invented an asbestos-based paint, which the United States government used and bought to paint Navy ships. They were involved in pipes and fire. It was a fire retardant type of paint. And interestingly, a lot of the folks that worked in the plant that made the paint came down with lung cancer and mesothelioma and those kinds of issues. So I'm very familiar with it. It's touched our family, as a matter of fact. And the fact that you're involved in so many of these cases, Steve, is terrific. It's good that you're fighting the fight for all of us, and especially for the veterans. So, in that light, what tests are needed to evaluate an asbestos-related disease when somebody's claiming, these kinds of issues? How do you test for that?
Well, you for things like lung cancer, it's just another cause of lung cancer, and it contributes along with cigarette smoking in a very dangerous way. So it's just a question of making the diagnosis. In a way, it's the same with mesothelioma, which can occur primarily in the area of the chest, but also throughout the abdomen. And the diagnosis itself can only really be made by looking at tissue under the microscope. But the symptoms, that, for example, in the chest that bring people to the doctor are things like pains that don't go away, shortness of breath, things like that, which would bring anybody to a doctor. And then the next step is chest X-rays, CAT scans, looking for particular kinds of masses. They don't necessarily feel any different to the patient, but that's why it's important that particularly when a vet has any of those kinds of symptoms, that they get some medical attention right away. It's not that the early diagnosis is going to produce a cure. We don't cure a lot of lung cancers, and so far we don't really cure any mesotheliomas, but they can be treated, and people can have a more comfortable clinical course, can live longer, can do better the sooner they make the diagnosis.
Interesting. Steve, I've had doctors tell me that by the time something shows up in an X-ray that indicates a tumor growth or something like that in the lung, it's almost too late to really do something about it. Ultimately, the patient has a real problem. Is that what you found as well?
Well, that's generally true, but, if you're the guy who beats it, then for you the odds are 100%. So, it's important. We've had cases where they've caught a mesothelioma extraordinarily early and removed it, and the guy's done fine. We've had other cases where people have lived a very long time with a disease that's usually fatal in a year or less. So if you get 10 good years from an early diagnosis, that's a lot better than dying in 6 months. So while it's not a cure, given the choice, I'd prefer it, and I'm sure most folks would.
Well, in San Diego, being, there's a veterans hospital here. Every time that I might drive by, go and see some friends, there's a tremendous wait line. There is months and months and months of years just to get a general checkup. And that's a real problem here in San Diego and some of the higher military arenas. Because, like you said, early diagnosis, Larry, is critical, and Steve will verify that. But if you can't get an appointment, then where's there opportunities to find that disease?
Well, the whole veterans medical system is a subject that you could spend a whole bunch of programs on. and it really is a serious problem.
No question about that, Steve. And of course, it gets into the political realm, and I know that's going to be a big debate as these presidential candidates move down towards November. It's clearly on the front burner for sure. Why don't you share a story with us, if you could, Steve, of a veteran who suffered from an asbestos-related disease and how they were compensated and how you dealt with that?
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about that, and there are two cases we did recently that sort of capture this. One was for a guy who entered the Army just as an enlisted man, came out 22 years later as a chief, but spent his military career running the motor pool, maintaining cars and trucks and so on. And so his exposure was largely like that of any auto mechanic. He developed mesothelioma. We pushed his case towards trial and were able to resolve it on terms that I can't discuss in terms of the total recovery. And he's a really interesting guy. His name was Bud Stillman, and he published a book, his biography about his military experience, which was titled "He Bleeds Olive Drab." And Bud was just a great guy. At the other end of the spectrum, we did a case recently for a man who graduated from the Naval Academy in the late 40s, was a naval aviator, ended up commanding the entire Pacific carrier fleet, and retired as a rear admiral. Bill developed mesothelioma, and we represented him and his family, and again, were able to resolve his case. And so, wherever you are on the military food chain, you're at risk, and there are all kinds of cases like this. Typically it's the guys who worked in the engine rooms, machinist mates, boiler techs, and so on, who had the most exposure. But guys in the Navy, are living on a ship 24/7. It's not like going to work for 40 hours a week. The entire ship gets contaminated with the asbestos. So wherever you are, you're breathing asbestos dust in the air. And the skill here for us, the art, is demonstrating exactly what the exposure was, whose asbestos products were involved, and then trying to hold those companies directly responsible. And, some cases go to trial. The majority of them settle. The cases that do go to trial, at least in our hands, tend to produce very good results for our clients in terms of money. In 40 plus years, we've never represented an asbestos victim who did not recover money, So not that there's any sure thing in life, but we've been very successful at getting compensation for veterans as well as others who've had asbestos disease over the years.
I certainly like those odds. It sounds good for the folks that at least are seeking some redress. And it's an interesting topic as well that I've noticed that a lot of the folks that not necessarily were right on the ship, but they, those that worked on the bases or near the bases, also were exposed in some way. Tell us about that kind of exposure, not the exposure of being confined on a ship, but generally in the surrounding area.
Well, sure. The interesting thing, of course, is asbestos disease, as I said, comes from breathing in the fibers. You don't get it through your fingers by handling the stuff. And so when it gets in the air, anybody in the neighborhood is in a position where they can breathe some. Now, the more you breathe in, the greater your risk. But we see cases of people who have sort of neighborhood exposure. They don't have to be ones working right with it. They can be in the vicinity. They can be in an office that's been remodeled, and there's dust still left behind. We see a lot of cases of people whose family members are the ones who worked with asbestos. The auto mechanic who takes dust home on his clothes or in his hair, gets it into the car, and the kids are exposed, and 40 years later they're dying. There are cases where people just live downwind from the shipyard or a factory, and it just blows into their property, into their homes, and they get exposed. So this is a very widespread problem that doesn't, of course, just affect veterans, but it does affect them very seriously, and it affects family members because, it's one thing if you're out at sea for 6 months. It's another if you're at home ported or in a shipyard for construction work and you're going home to your family.
Yeah, every night bringing that into the house. You're right. Manny, why don't you talk about the litigation? Let's talk litigation.
Well, I think it's we need firms like Steve's firms to bring us all this information to bear. I think that as veterans are considered for service, I mean, we all go in with the assumption that we're going to contribute and come back and hopefully and live a reasonable and comfortable life here in our country. Unfortunately, as Steve was talking, my father was also a veteran, and he worked at Camp Pendleton for 50 years, and he worked in the warehouses. And again, as he's talking, my father died from lung cancer. And I just didn't even think about it, to be honest with you, Steve. I just thought it because he was older. He was in his late 70s, and also he was a smoker, but I'm sure that didn't help. I'm sure it didn't. Being in Camp Pendleton as a warehouseman, he was always in the warehouses, moving equipment, moving, supplies, you might say, with forklifts and being in a confined area for, 53 years in a sense, So, wow, it's just kind of eye-opening.
But that's not a surprising story to you, Steve. I'm sure you've heard stories like that from a lot of folks that worked in those kinds of environments that developed lung cancer and maybe didn't realize the implication of, let's say, cigarette smoking exacerbated by the asbestos. And a lot of those folks, I think, were working a little bit in the dark on those issues, weren't they?
Well, they really were, and that's because they weren't getting warned by anybody who made and sold this stuff. And the combination of cigarette smoking and asbestos exposure is particularly dangerous because they don't only add up as factors, they actually multiply each other. So, if a smoker is at a 10 times normal risk of lung cancer and a guy working around asbestos is at a 5 times normal risk, you do both, you're now at a 50 times or 90 time risk. And so it's a very serious problem. People were exposed and they didn't know it. And even if they knew it, they didn't know of the dangers because nobody was telling them until the 1970s. And so you have generations of people who were exposed unknowingly and would never think of it. They get sick 40 years later, and they may not remember that summer job or the brief exposure.
Well, it's kind of like Manny said. He thought back after you spoke and said, "Boy, my dad, I didn't realize the connection maybe between working in Camp Pendleton's warehouse and the smoking, and then it's kind of a revelation that comes." Upon learning about the knowledge about what asbestos can do and how it can interact.
And he was also in the Navy himself in World War II. So, it's quite a combination now that I've been, listening to Steve.
No question about that. Let's take a quick break right now and be back in a minute with our special guest, Steve Kazan, and our co-host, Manny Valdez. We'll be right back.
This is Ringler Radio from Ringler Associates, the leader in the structured settlements profession nationwide. Did you know that Ringler is involved in a third of all structured settlement cases in the country? Ringler Associates works with all the parties in a lawsuit settlement to find the best possible financial solution for the people involved. There's a Ringler Associate in all the major cities of the U.S. No one has more experience than a Ringler Associate. Check out our new website, at www.ringlerassociates.com for the best information for claimants, legal professionals, and claims personnel, and to find the Ringler associate nearest you. When it's your interest at stake in a lawsuit settlement, you want only the best financial plan. You can count on Ringler Associates to structure a customized plan that meets the needs of you and your family for the future. Visit ringlerassociates.com to learn more.
Welcome back to Ringler Radio. Glad you could join us. I'm joined by my co-host, Manny Valdez, and our special guest, attorney Steven Kazan, founding senior and managing principal of the firm Kaizen, McClain, Satterley, and Greenwood in Oakland, California.
Steve, I got to be honest with you. That's really interesting, though. I mean, all that counting of information. I mean, and quite honestly, most of the people that I knew that were in the military, I was in Vietnam in '68, '69. Most of us were just young kids, and we were all typically from the poor side of the income of the families, and either draftees or RAs. But we weren't even thinking about exposure to anything. We just got to get a job done. And so now you come back and you don't even get educated. I mean, you don't even have an opportunity to seek, any kind of service, assistance. Then it becomes really difficult to really get it,
You know something, Steve? As Manny said, the experience of the Vietnam vets, I know, is probably more significant than a lot of others because there really wasn't a lot of knowledge back then. But in recent years, our troops have been coming back from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And how have you seen the exposure that those vets have had versus the Vietnam vets? What kind of differences have you seen in the exposure rates to things like mesothelioma?
Well, it's interesting. Because it takes mesothelioma minimum 20, 25 years usually, and often as long as 40 or 50 years from the first exposure until there's a disease that can be diagnosed. Obviously, we're not yet seeing any disease from Iraq or Afghanistan. We are now sort of at the peak of the time period for Vietnam, because that's 50 years ago. And in fact, the guys whose cases I mentioned, Bud served in Vietnam. Bill ran the evacuation through Carrier Group 7. He was offshore and involved in all of that stuff. And those guys were at peak exposure because the Navy ships back then were all full of asbestos. I mean, a lot of them were World War II vintage, and very few were brand new, and the Navy was still using asbestos in ship construction into the 70s. Now, the ships today are less full of asbestos than they were back then. Newer ships are generally built mostly without it, and the attention to the health and safety issues are greater in the shipyards now than they were back then. So hopefully we won't have nearly as much asbestos disease develop over the next 20 or 30 years from the guys who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we're going to still see some because there are still guys, working in the motor pools. There's a lot of debris that was created there, some of which contained asbestos. And, in Vietnam, guys were living in Quonset huts that had asbestos cement built into them. Now it appears from what I see on TV that the living arrangements are a little safer, at least with respect to asbestos. So hopefully we're not going to be seeing nearly the volume of disease from these events as we've done in the past from Korea.
A lot of the reduction in disease that you're anticipating has to do with, the scientific evidence that has been shown over the years, the corrections in certain building materials, and the realization of what asbestos can do to the human body. And in addition to the science, a lot of the changes result as a result of litigation that you've helped to champion in this area. So tell us a little bit about mesothelioma settlements. Tell us about the amounts of the settlements and compensation for victims and their families, and also, if you could, touch on whether structured settlements have played a role in any of the settlements you've been involved in.
Well, structured settlements are often potentially very useful. The thing I like about them is particularly it helps you make sure that nobody can screw up more than a month at a time.
Right.
And that can often be an issue because, if the client is someone who has had a sophisticated business career and deals with money all the time, that's one thing. But, a lot of our clients are just sort of normal folks who've never had large sums of money involved. And when somebody gets a lot of money, it brings friends and relatives out of the woodwork.
A lot of new advisors show up. Yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of amounts, in our office, we never publish or publicize the amount of settlements. Those are confidential. And, we tell every defendant, you settle with us, no one will know what you paid. You go to trial with us, we've never had a confidential jury verdict, and everybody's going to know, what you got hit for. But in general, settlements for mesothelioma cases depend on a lot of factors, but at a minimum, in our hands, they're seven-figure cases. Some are, over $10 million. But that's not the usual. I mean, a lot of factors go into the value, not the least of which is age and earning capacity. Family members, cases where there's a spouse, a higher value than if there's no spouse. Having children also helps, no matter how old they are.
So, Steve, as we wrap this up, what advice do you have for our listeners about what the next steps ought to be, and things mentioned about the lawyers that they should be encountering to try to help them fight the battle to get justice for what's happened to them from an asbestos-related disease?
But one of the things that we tell people is that, and I may be getting ahead of where you want to go, but a great deal depends on who the lawyer is. Just like anything else in life, skill can make a difference. And for folks faced with this disease, the medical issues are, of course, paramount importance. But the legal issues are also very important because who you hire in a case like this, we tell people, is the single most important financial decision they will ever make in their lives. People should understand that mesothelioma cases not only are worth a great deal of money for a family that wants to build security, but they're also worth money to lawyers. And as a result, if you go to Google and search for anything relating to mesothelioma, you're going to see all kinds of ads. They're the most expensive ads on the internet. When you turn on the TV, you're going to see lots of commercials for lawyers on mesothelioma. What people need to understand is that most of those TV ads are from guys who are really just brokers. They're not really lawyers who are going to handle the case, but they're going to sell it to lawyers who do the work. So people who are in need of representation need to be very careful and look into who the lawyers are. Now, obviously, we think that we're terrific, and we're always glad to talk to people about their legal needs. Sometimes we're not the right firm, and we'll make sure they get to where they should go. But, we think we do a really good job and better than anybody else. And on our website, we have some articles that explain how you go about hiring a lawyer, the questions to ask and the things to consider. So we would invite people to take a look and let us know if they have any questions. We're we free advice and glad to talk to folks, particularly veterans.
Well, that sounds like great advice, Steve, and I want to thank you for that. And if somebody wanted to get a hold of you, get in touch with you, talk to you, and maybe look into some of that research that you mentioned on your website, how would they go about contacting you?
Well, our website is pretty available. It's kazanlaw.com, Kazan, and it's easy to contact us through that. You can just click on it, and one of our staff will talk to you online right then. You can call us. You can just send a quick email, and we'll respond. We have a staff standing by to assist folks who need advice.
Terrific. And Manny, if someone wanted to talk to you, how would they do that?
Yeah, we have, of course, our Ringler website, national website that you could look us up. And we have an 800 line at 877-231-3334. So either way, appreciate it.
Terrific. And I want to tell our audience that if you want to reach any Ringler associate, you can go to our website, ringlerassociates.com. It's got a lot of tremendous information about a lot of different subjects. And, of course, you can find all the Ringler associates all over the country on that website. And, of course, you could also find the Ringler Radio shows, the many, many, many shows we've done like this one. You can find them on ringlerassociates.com, ringlerradio.com, LegalTalkNetwork.com, or on iTunes, where you can download the show and listen to it at your leisure as you learn more about subjects as important as the one we've discussed today about mesothelioma and asbestos. And with that, I'd like to thank Steve Kazan. I'd like to thank you very much for being a guest. You were terrific.
Well, thank you, Larry. It's been my pleasure, and nice to meet you and Manny.
And Manny, thank you for being a great co-host.
Well, I appreciate it, Larry, again. Thank you, Steve, for bringing us all up to date. Appreciate it.
Terrific. And for all of you out there, go have a great day. Bye-bye.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. Thanks for listening to Ringler Radio. With over 1 million listeners, Ringler Associates, the first name in structured settlements. Visit ringlerassociates.com today.